Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I am your host, Lamont Gates, once again bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicality, and spirituality. Today, my guest was clinically dead for 8 minutes, and during such, she experienced an otherworldly phenomenon. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you near-death experiencer, Krista Gorman. Krista, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'm glad to have you on as well. And many people may know you, Krista, from the National Geographic's presentation entitled The Story of God, which was hosted by Morgan Freeman, to which you sat down and gave your NDE to Morgan Freeman. What was that earthly phenomenon like in and of itself?
Well, it was amazing. To say the least, it was quite an honor to get to be in front of a person that, I've known since I was a kid and, in films and television and whatnot. And just to be in front of him was quite an experience. He's quite a presence. And he is someone I could feel is searching, and he is looking for answers to his questions, the same questions we all have. And that was, beyond words, amazing.
Very impressive to see you on television with such a A-list celebrity who, as you said, is searching for, I think, what we're all searching for. And that's why we're glad to have you here today on Real Spiritual Talk Radio. Now, before we actually get into your account, I like to walk backwards a little bit with my guests and get religiously acquainted with them. What was your religious or spiritual upbringing, if any, prior to your near-death experience?
Well, I grew up Catholic. My parents both went to Catholic school and practiced Catholicism regularly. We were weekly church attenders, and I made my first communion. I was confirmed in the Catholic Church as a teenager. And then as I got into my mid-teens, I started to question things. I was seeing one thing and hearing one thing when I went to church, and then experiencing a different thing in my home. And I couldn't reconcile the two. And so I took a step back from the church for many years. And it was sort of on a path of just self-exploration, that many of us go through in our teen years, early 20s. And at the age of 24, my father is what we would call a functional alcoholic. And I was sort of following along just mindlessly. And I realized that alcohol played too much of a role in my life. And I decided to just remove it from my life at 24. And I found a new spirituality. And for me, I felt most at home and most myself when I was in nature. And so nature was my temple. Nature was my God. And so that's where I was at the time that I experienced, death in terms of spirituality.
And speaking of death, why don't we go into your near-death experience? First and foremost, why don't you talk to us about what it was that actually triggered your near-death experience?
I was 29 years old, and I was in active labor with my daughter, my first child, my only child. And I experienced what's called an amniotic fluid embolism. What happened was I suddenly had a lot of difficulty breathing, and my heart was fluttering in my chest. And as soon as I verbalized, like, I'm having trouble breathing, the nurses just jumped in and put oxygen on me, turned me on my side, as we do. I'm a PA, so, medical training, this is what you do when a mother in labor is in distress. You turn them on their left side because it helps the heart pump blood to the unborn baby. And they started wheeling me out of the room. And just that couple of seconds that passed, I was having more and more respiratory distress, where to the point where I was trying to suck air in through, it felt like I was trying to suck it in through a teeny tiny little straw. And I just couldn't get any more air in. And in the hallway, they were wheeling me out of the room across the hall to the operating area. They were going to do an emergency C-section. And I just went out. Everything just started to fade to black. And as that was happening, I remember this feeling of peace just sort of like coming from behind me. And there was no fear. There was no like feeling of real panic. It was, I have never been so focused in my life on something, which was bringing air into my lungs. And I was just hyper focused on that. And so then this peace came over me, and I was gone. And the next point of my awareness was me high above what I later realized was my body below. But at the time, I had no understanding of a human experience. I was just this pure awareness, pure consciousness there. And I was still Krista in the sense that I know myself, and I could see. That was the only sense that I had. And I watched as these little black particles came racing up to where my vision was, high above. And I was sort of like there in this static cloud. And I recall just being curious and, this is really interesting. A detached curiosity. And then I moved over to the other side of the room. As I was watching, I watched my daughter what I later found out was my daughter being born, and my doctor handing her to someone at my shoulder who was a nurse anesthetist. And she took Maggie and turned around, and I couldn't see her. And I was like, oh, what's that? I'm really curious. What is that? And I wanted to see. I had this desire to know what was going on. And that desire grew, I felt a tug, and it pulled to my left, and I resisted because I wanted to know what was going on, and it pulled harder. And then I said, okay. And as soon as I felt that release or acceptance of, okay, I'll go, I moved very quickly out of that space, and it was through the wall. The wall had become sort of liquidy, and I went through the wall and into this bright white flash of light, and then into the dense dark particles that I was sort of reabsorbed into it, and I was moving imperceptibly fast. It's almost like I wasn't moving, but I was. And the side of me was the dark particles, and then it would become sort of liquidy at points, and then dense particles again. And then all of a sudden I just stopped, and I had this download of information, and it's instantaneous. And it was I can liken it to all the questions I'd ever had were answered, and they all boiled down to one thing, and that was love. And it was like when it went like, and love was there. And I felt this incredible bliss. It's beyond words. It's indescribable. Just this all-encompassing, amazing, wonderful, unconditional love, feeling of just eternal love. And I just, if I were a human being, I would have had the hugest smile on my face and just like this awe. And over to my right, I noticed a white dot of light, and it sort of was, it was calling to me. I could feel it. It wanted me to come to it. And I chose to go that way. So I started moving in that direction. And as I got closer, it got wider and wider. And it was this sort of cloudy atmosphere, and there were shadow beings there. And the shadow beings, they needed my help. And there was a little boy in the front, and he needed my help. And so I wanted to help him. And I moved into the space, and they sort of fanned out to my left, and I was in the space, and the little boy was gone, and I could feel the adult shadow beings all needing my help, and I felt back, yes, I want to help you. So they started to come at me, started darting at me one by one, and darting away very quickly, and I could feel my energy sort of diminishing in there, much like how I felt as I was passing out in the hallway, losing my consciousness. And I felt, no, I want to, like, I don't want to be here. I wanted to keep going, keep existing. So I was pulled out of there and back into the particulate matter that I had been in before. And that opened, there was a less distinct opening. It was the dense particulate matter, and there was sort of a circle there. And I moved through it into this gorgeous landscape, and it had yellow flowers and a rocky moss covered waterfall to my left, and a dense dark evergreen forest on my right. And then out in front of me, there were these green rolling hills and blue sky and trees dotted. And there was a sun off somewhere to my left because it was illuminated. And as I merged out, as I came out of the particulate matter, I just was merged with all of the beauty that was in front of me. And we became one, and I was it was me. And it was just bliss. Once again, it was just that feeling of unconditional love, and I could have stayed there eternally. And then I was flanked on both sides by what they were like spiritual guides. We would call them angels here. And communication was through feeling. Through my entire experience, it was through the sense of feeling, of emotions and energy. And so they communicated to me, you can stay here, you can go to beyond this to what comes next, or you can go back. And I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a sense of it, really. It was sort of neutral. And I had no recall of my life as a human being. I didn't know what going back was. And I just said, I'll go back. And as soon as I felt that, I started moving backward, and they sort of turned to me in this opening, and they communicated, if you go back, you need to share what you learned here. And I agreed. And then the next thing I remember was having a lot of pain in the center of my chest. And then waking up in the ICU and wanting to leave. I had memories of who I was, what I had just graduated from my PA training program 3 weeks before, and I already had a job lined up. And I announced to the nurse who I was going to be working for, and she put it down in quotes in my chart because it indicated that my brain was working. And at the time, they weren't sure. After I coded for 8 minutes, and they had to stop chest compressions for 2 minutes while they delivered my daughter. And I was intubated, sedated, in a medical coma for about 36 hours before they elected, because I had been so stable that whole time, they elected to wean me off of the medication, extubate me, and see how I did. And so I was coming around. And once I announced who I was and what I was going to be doing, they decided it would be best, at that point, they could move me out of the ICU, and they put me in my own room. And that's where I stayed for about 6 days before I met my daughter for the first time. And I had no memory of any of this yet. My NDE, the experience, came to me in sleep several weeks later. Yeah.
I have a few questions going back to your very start of going into this otherworldly place. You said that you went from one place into this circular type of object. Did it feel like you were going from one environment to another environment?
Yes, it was. It was. Yeah, it was different realms, different. I feel, having 22 years to sort of reflect on this and grow as a person, and learn and find what resonates with me about NDEs and life and all that we experience here. What I understand now is that these were different levels of vibration, of energy. And I experienced, several of them while I was gone.
You say that you met with these shadow entities and that they were looking for some sort of help from you. Did you ever get to establish what type of help they needed?
Not specifically. They were, Lee Whitting, who has NDE Radio. He and I were talking about this one time, and he mentioned the concept of bardo, the Buddhist bardo, and that resonated. I felt like they were entities that were in between worlds, and they required energy to move from where they were. They were sort of stuck. And I was a volunteer in that space with them. And I was because we have free will here, in my experience, we have free will here, we have free will in the afterlife. I chose to move into that space with them. And when they started to utilize my energy for themselves, because I willingly said, communicated. I didn't say, I communicated, I want to help you. They could have, I could have just dissipated in that space, essentially. But I chose to continue. And through free will, I chose to continue. And for me, I learned that experience in that space was to show me in my earthly life, because this was all created by me and for me. I was showing myself that in order to help people in this world, I have to choose me first. So if I'm healthy, if I'm caring for myself first, then I have more to give others. And that has experience has helped me tremendously in my life as a PA and provider of care for other people.
Spirituality to us humans who have never had a near death experience is an absolute mystery. We've all come upon the question, where did we come from? Where are we going? Is there something else after this, etc.? But in your near death experience, it was communicated to you telepathically that they wanted you to share your experience about the reality of that existence, the existence of this place.
Yes, they did, and it's the words used to explain or to describe the communication it wasn't telepathic in terms of brain to brain. It was empathic. It was energy, and that was another very important piece for me, to bring back from my experience. And it was the love. It was that love is the answer to everything, absolutely everything. You can break anything apart, and at its fundamental nature, it's love. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about. And that may be hard for some people to hear because we live in this world of ego. But really, the reality is that everything is love.
And that seems to be our core theme in just about all near-death experiences. That
Yeah.
love is the answer to everything. I know you said you were downloaded with so much information, and it answered every single question you actually had, and you said it boiled down to love.
Yeah.
So I guess you can say your near-death experience is one of many that is telling us the exact same message concerning where we are in this realm, that it's love that matters. Now, you stated that you were dead for 8 minutes. I know you said you are also a PA, which is a physician assistant, correct?
Yes.
Did someone express to you or at a later point in time that you did code for 8 minutes?
Yes. I was in the hospital, and my physician, my OB, and the cardiologist who happened to be at the hospital at the time of the code blue, that responded to the code, came into my room and explained what happened to me. Now, I was still, I had short-term memory loss. Hadn't recalled I was pregnant. I couldn't remember my daughter's name. I couldn't remember my name. I thought my now ex-husband at the time, my husband, I thought he was a volunteer at the hospital because he was just always there. And I was trying to piece my understanding of my world and my life before back together. My brain was healing. But when my physicians came in the room to explain things to me, my response was, "But I'm okay now." And they just laughed, because I had no clue the gravity of my situation. And I not only did I have a cardiorespiratory arrest for 8 minutes, but I also went into what's called disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC, which is your body is unable to clot your blood. So I was having a cesarean section. I was bleeding profusely, and they had to stop chest compressions because I was bleeding so profusely. That would have, if they had continued chest compressions, I would have died there on the table. I mean, they probably wouldn't have been able to bring me back due to the volume of blood loss that would have occurred. So it was a choice that they made, and so yeah, I have I have a whole new appreciation for my experience, in retrospect. At the time, I was like, yeah, but everything's good, you guys. You're getting upset over nothing.
Yes, I can imagine how scary it is to be told, hey, well, you were dead for 8 minutes and you knew nothing about it. Going back to the National Geographic's presentation, The Story of God, to which you were a participant of, I can recall actually watching that. And a friend of mine who had lost his mother recently, I brought him over one night and I had watched it myself. And I said, you know what, this would be a good episode to show him. He had just lost his mother and he was asking the same questions. Where did she go? He was brought up a Catholic, but he was very curious about what happened to his mother afterwards. He was extremely close with her. So I
Mm.
brought him in and I showed him your clip, giving your near-death experience to Morgan Freeman, and he walked out of there feeling a bit more assured. So my next question to you is, what kind of after effects have you had since your near death experience? I know one of the things you can probably attest to is telling your story, which is the mission that you were sent back to do, and you've probably seen a lot of people also assured. But was there anything else that you come back with that you find unusual prior to your near death experience?
That's a really great question. I get that question often, and for me, I have the it's clear sentience, I believe it's called, where I feel I know somebody. I know them on almost a molecular level, um, when we meet, and it's very interesting when it happens, because it happens for me through the eyes. And in my death experience, I could see. That was my only of the five senses that I had. And then, of course, this, what we call the sixth sense, the empathic abilities. But I feel like I can read somebody very, very clearly, without having to have, without having to exchange words with them. It's not something that I practice or that I use as a tool or anything like that. It's just in my everyday life. I feel that way. And also that I have a sense of the future, of being able to look at present events, and be able to predict what the next steps are going to be up to a point. The pandemic was one that I worked as a PA in field hospitals for COVID. And in New York City, I was at the Billie Jean King Tennis Center. And when this first came out, I just knew that it would become endemic, and that this was something that was meant to, this is just broadly speaking, this is meant to be something that catapults humanity forward in terms of our spiritual evolution here. And that it's a tool that we can use to help ourselves grow as spiritual beings here in these physical bodies, in this physical world. Because this is not the end.
Yeah, and I can see where that can come into play. The pandemic got a lot of people closer than perhaps they were prior to the pandemic. A lot of people had to stay at home, and so they bonded in their relationships with families and with friends that they most likely couldn't have done if this pandemic didn't happen. At least that's one thing I can see that came out of it. Funny thing is, I reached out to you for an interview back when I was starting this show, Real Spiritual Talk Radio, back in 2020, and you responded to me saying that you were very busy because you were in the middle of this pandemic, fighting it on the front lines as one of the medical professionals. And then we kind of lost contact, but here we are again. So I'm very grateful for this interview. Very grateful.
Me too. Thank you. Me
I
too.
know, absolutely. I know that you also are an author after your near death experience. You have a book. Why don't you tell us a bit about that and where we can find it?
Sure. I would call myself a reluctant author, only because that book, it's called I Died and Learned How to Live, and it's on Amazon, and it's self-published. It is truly a labor of love. It came out in 2014, and my NDE was in 2000. And I spent 10 years trying to live my life without processing my NDE, without having the burden, as I saw it back then, of processing my NDE and living as the love I knew that I wanted and needed to live as in this life. It took a lot of self-reflection, of self-healing in my life. Now, I haven't had major traumas in terms of, if we had to grade traumas and experiences that individuals have. For me, myself, growing up, my sort of quote unquote trauma was emotional trauma of living in this world and finding myself in this world, trying to find myself in this world, navigating this world as a human being. And I got to a point 10 years after my experience where I knew that I needed to really look at my NDE. I had to integrate its messages, and I had to transform myself as a person in order to be happy, in order to find happiness. Boy, it was rough for me for several years. And through tools that are very much, I believe, taken for granted, such as meditation. Meditation is what helped me to connect with the greater part of me that is part of the universe, to connect with the collective of all of us are part of the universe. We are just inextricably connected with the universe in these bodies. And I was able to tap into my experience and be able to put it into words. And I created what I called the 12 principles for daily living. And they're words, ideas, experiences, ultimately an experience of a way of being in the body that actually help to bring me, when I'm practicing these things, they help to bring me to closest to how I felt in my NDE as I've ever been back in this body, to how I felt there. The love, the bliss, the freedom, the loving detachment, just everything is wonderful kind of feeling. Joy while I'm doing my 9 to 5, while I'm cleaning the house kind of thing. So that's what I wanted to share with the world. That was what I felt I came back to share with the world. I had to put it into the context of my NDE. So I wrote my NDE out and put it in the book as an afterthought. I had the 12 principles in there because these are the things that helped heal me. These are the things that I use in my daily life that are just so helpful. And so I went back and I put my NDE as the context. I'm like, of course, people are going to want to read about it, So I thought, oh, there's so many stories about NDEs. People can read about these anywhere. But I found that the people wanted the NDE. They wanted to know what it was about. So that's where the book came in. And I've revised it several times, just finding my own little typos or whatever errors in there as I look at it, but and go through it again because I did it all myself. And it's really just a labor of love for people who are meant to find it and read it. They find it and they read it.
And that's absolutely fascinating. Now, I want to end this interview the way I kind of started it, with the religious question. Now that you've had your near-death experience, looking back at how you are questioning things, has anything changed in your view of religion or spirituality in your post-near-death experience?
I would probably sum it up and say, and this is how, Morgan Freeman asked me. He said, religion, you got one? And I said, love is my religion. It's what I practice every day. So that is it for me. And whatever brings me closer to love is what I do.
Which goes back to the answer you were given to all your questions in the first place.
Right.
During your near-death experience.
Yes.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, Krista, I want to thank you for coming on Real Spiritual Talk Radio and sharing with us your absolutely amazing account.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Krista Gorman.